So here's the situation. In this video, I wanted to dive into some Montreal Canadiens trade talk. We're going to dive into some trade prices. We're going to dive into guys that could be moved and asking whether or not they actually should be moved, as incited by other sources. So, of course, you already saw the title, you already saw the thumbnail. Today, we are diving into some interesting updates in regards to Matheson. We're also going to be talking about Kirby Dach, Newhook, and some folks over in Pittsburgh as well. Let's start out with Matheson here, because the 31-year-old defenseman, 6'2", 187 pounds, is in a pretty interesting spot with the Canadiens. $4.875 million a year till the end of this upcoming season, and the guy currently does not have a contract that extends beyond that. He had himself a pretty down year compared to the previous season. 62 points in 82 games in 23-24, literally cut that production in half for 31 points in 24-25. But nobody's really blaming this guy. That's the thing, right? We all kind of recognize that Mike Matheson was the top power play guy in Montreal for a while. He excelled in that role. He was one of the most productive defensemen in the NHL that season. And the only reason he dipped to half the points the season after is because of a guy named Lane Hutson, who took his spot on Power Play 1 and who will probably be the Power Play 1 guy until he retires. Like, he is so good. So I don't think there's any realistic scenario where Matheson is over Hutson, especially now with Dobson in the mix too. This guy has no chance of being a top power play guy in Montreal any further. But because of that, you can debate that with the contract, with the spot in the lineup, he's projected to maybe playing behind Hutson and Guhle. With all these things putting themselves in the forefront, now it's a reasonable thought to hypothesize a Mike Matheson trade. An idea that was actually refuted on L'Antichambre by Vince Damphousse. This is the tweet from earlier in the season, and Damphousse went out there and said this: Matheson, for me, you don't trade that player for a draft pick. He's a D-man who was a number 1 and a number 2 here, and he's already signed to an extraordinary contract under $5 million. You can't just give him away for a second-round pick. Now, this article is from a few days ago, even though the tweet itself that it cites is from February, literally half a year ago. But I think this sentiment can still be pretty rationed out by Canadiens fans, especially those who are trying to take a look at the team from a pure value perspective in terms of who's on the ice and how good can they be. Mike Matheson is a good defenseman, and of course, with more power play time, he would definitely have more points than he had scored this recent season. The only question is, though, is he too valuable to play in the bottom of the lineup? If you assume that the top 4 looks something like Dobson, Hutson, Guhle, and Carrier, Matheson is the odd guy out. He is a top 4 defenseman playing outside of the top 4, rotating around with Struble and potentially Reinbacher and anybody else that can be in those bottom pairs. But Matheson and the trade idea, there are a lot of folks that will rebuke against it, like Damphousse, who says that he's so valuable you don't trade this guy for a draft pick. I'll ask the question to you, though: does this guy get traded, and do you think he should? Two separate questions, technically. But if it were up to you, what does the fate of Mike Matheson look like in your mind? Now, let's shift gears a little bit from talking about Mike Matheson over to yet another conversation regarding the Pittsburgh Penguins. We're heading over onto NHL Rumor Report because they tweeted this out a few days ago. It was the price, as Josh Yohei went on to the Athletic Hockey Show to talk about Pittsburgh Penguins forwards Bryan Rust and Rickard Rakell. I wonder what you can get in return, Yohei says. Kyle Dubas wants NHL-ready players more than anything. What he wants are 22-year-old guys that can play right now. And here is the thing. The trade price, it's not really all too surprising, but it does allow us to dive into some hypotheticals for the Montreal Canadiens. assuming that a Rust or a Rakell could be a target for Kent Hughes and his squad. Might I remind you, Rickard Rakell can play center. He was primarily a winger when used alongside of Sidney Crosby, but he can play C. If you dive into what the Canadiens have that is in this territory, 22-year-old guys that can play right now, they might not be 22 exactly, but there are some names that are in that young-ish age range on the Habs. Here's a poll on HabsFanatics.com from yesterday, 23 hours ago, as this article goes out there and uses that same NHL Rumor Report tweet. The question here is, would you trade Kirby Dach and Alex Newhook and a high draft pick for Rickard Rakell? Dach and Newhook were both 2019 draftees, which means that they are 24 years old at the moment. They're not 22, but they are in that range. The question is here, and there's 1,300 answers. I'm just going to go out there and cut the crap and say yes. And then let's go over to the poll and see what the Habs fans going out there and saying. All right. So the majority of the Canadiens fans on HabsFanatics.com are actually saying no. They would not trade Kirby Dach plus Newhook plus a high pick for Rickard Rakell. Now, I can understand why that is. Habs fans could be looking at it saying, okay, well, Kirby Dach has X amount of value, Newhook has Y amount of value, not to mention a high draft pick. Don't the Canadiens need a lot of those? Why would they trade away 2 roster forwards and a high pick for a guy who can come over and just be one guy? Like, Newhook and Dach, at the very least, are 2 assets that can have some sort of an impact in the lineup. Why trade 2 for 1, especially when you're adding on a high pick? But I think a lot of it has to do with the upside of the assets involved. Yes, a high draft pick is valuable, but we've seen that the Montreal Canadiens can make do with picks that aren't necessarily all too high. And also you can say, they're in a spot where they've already started selling. They just traded away 2 top draft picks in the 2025 draft to get Noah Dobson. They're already starting to make that transition into a more competitive, retool, let's use our future draft picks to help us out in the now type of mindset. And so honestly, when you're getting rid of a high draft pick to get Rickard Rakell back, I actually do think it's pretty okay. Add on Dach and Newhook, and I get it, you don't want to trade away these guys for one asset. You don't want to technically limit the amount of assets you have on your team up front at the moment. But I do think Rickard Rakell is all that, and he could be a very good second-line center option, assuming he can play center full-time, alongside of Ivan Demidov and Patrick Laine. Rickard Rakell this season had 70 points, 81 games played, 35 goals and 35 assists. He has been lightning in a bottle in Pittsburgh. Aside the 23-24 year where he only had 37 points, he had 60 points, then 37, then 70. Like, how does that happen? Sidney Crosby. That's how it happens. And I don't want to make it seem like Sid the Kid and Rickard Rakell, these are the only ways you're going to be able to get Rakell going is if you play him with Sidney Crosby. I think he can probably be fine if he's playing on a second line with sheltered minutes with like a Demidov or a Laine or something. He was a top-line guy in Pittsburgh after all. But I'll pose the same question to you here on this YouTube video. When you see that the price for Rickard Rakell and Bryan Rust is 22-year-old guys that can play right now, do you think that Dach, Newhook, and a high draft pick gets it done for Rakell? Dach and Newhook are not 22, they're a little bit older, so why not add on a high draft pick to make it more enticing for Kyle Dubas? I think from the Penguins' perspective, this would fit with what it is they're trying to do, but I question whether or not you'd actually think it's worth it. So, Habs fans, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Firstly, about Mike Matheson and his trade status. Secondly, about the idea of a Dach and Newhook trade for Rickard Rakell. Let me know in the comments all your opinions about these trade ideas. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.